Ever feel like election season just never ends, like it's one right after another?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, India's considering a bold solution,
Oh,
what they call one nation, one election. And today, we are diving deep into this proposal to see if it's, a brilliant fix or a potential political earthquake. What do you think?
it's definitely creating a lot of buzz, that's for sure. And, the implications go far beyond India itself because this touches on how democracies function all over the world.
Right. And we've got a ton of research here, government reports, think tank analyses. We've even got some pretty fiery opinions from India's political parties.
Oh, wow.
And here's the kicker. Simultaneous elections, they aren't a new idea for India.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they actually held them from 1951 to 1967.
That's right. And, that history makes this even more fascinating. Like, why did the system break down? Could it work in today's India?
Yeah.
A country with, what, over 1.3 billion people and such a complex political landscape?
So for those unfamiliar, one nation, one election, or ONOE for short, it means holding elections for the Lok Sabha,
Uh-huh.
India's parliament,
Okay.
and all state assembly elections at the same time.
Wow.
So imagine like a single election deciding everything from your local representative all the way up to the prime minister.
Exactly. And you know what that means, right? It means coordinating elections across 28 states and 8 union territories. We are talking about a massive logistical undertaking here.
Yeah.
And it even has the potential for, as one article called it, voter fatigue and logistical nightmares.
Logistical nightmares. That's definitely something I want to unpack a little bit later.
Yeah.
But first, let's look at why some people think this is actually a good idea. Efficiency seems to be a big selling point for ONOE supporters.
Absolutely. The potential cost savings are huge. I mean, fewer elections means less strain on administrative and security forces, not to mention the direct costs of actually running the elections.
Right.
Think about all the resources that go into each individual election, polling booths, ballot printing, personnel, security. I mean, it adds up.
Right. That makes sense.
Right.
And it's not just about saving money.
Right.
Less time campaigning could mean more time actually, governing.
Oh, for sure.
One report even mentioned businesses being hesitant to invest in the months leading up to an election.
Really?
Yeah, fearing policy changes and stuff. So could fewer elections create a more stable and predictable economy?
That's exactly the argument proponents are making. They believe that fewer elections would lead to less political maneuvering and a greater focus on long-term policymaking.
Right.
Instead of constantly being in campaign mode, elected officials could focus on, actually governing and implementing those long-term policies.
Okay, I see the logic there.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that assume that voters are making well-informed choices based on those long-term goals? Couldn't it backfire if voters are just swayed by, like, the national rhetoric and overlook important local issues?
That's a great question. And it brings us to another potential benefit that's often cited by ONOE supporters, increased voter turnout.
Oh, interesting.
The thinking is that a single high-stakes election would just generate more excitement and engagement, which would lead to higher voter participation.
So it's like election day becomes a bigger deal when it encompasses everything, from local to national politics.
Yeah, exactly.
But wouldn't a higher turnout potentially favor national parties with more resources to run those big attention-grabbing campaigns?
That's certainly a possibility. And critics of ONOE worry that syncing state elections with national ones could overshadow those local issues,
Right.
giving an unfair advantage to national parties. They argue that the distinct needs and concerns of different states could get lost in the noise of national politics.
So it's like, those local issues, which might be hugely important to people's daily lives, just get drowned out by the big national conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that concern about, like, national parties taking over, it seems to be a key point for groups like the Congress Party, who, according to one article, are strongly opposed to ONOE and concerned about potential bias.
Exactly. And beyond the concerns about fairness, there's another line of criticism that we need to consider. Some people argue that frequent elections, while they can be disruptive, are actually a good thing for a healthy democracy.
Really?
Yeah, they see regular elections as a vital way to hold leaders accountable and prevent power from becoming too concentrated.
So it becomes a trade-off. On one hand, you have the potential stability and efficiency of ONOE.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you have the accountability and more frequent checks on power that come with the current system. It's a complex issue with valid points on both sides. And then, of course, there's the question of how you actually implement such a major change. We'll talk about the logistics, but this isn't just about scheduling, is it?
You're right. This goes beyond logistics. It's a constitutional issue. Amending India's constitution is no small feat. I
Right.
mean, we're talking about changing the articles that deal with how long governments can last and when
Exactly.
elections happen, Articles 83, 85, 172, and even 356, which deals with the president taking over a state's government under certain circumstances.
So hypothetically, let's say they did manage to amend the Constitution.
Mm.
How would this actually work on the ground in a country as vast and diverse as India?
Right.
You mentioned logistical nightmares earlier.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Imagine the sheer scale of the operation, ensuring you have enough polling booths across thousands of constituencies, training millions of election officials, maintaining security to ensure a free and fair election. It's a monumental task, as one source describes it, and that's not even considering potential disruptions like natural disasters or political instability in a specific state.
Right. India faces a wide range of challenges from, monsoons to regional conflicts. Any one of those could disrupt a nationwide election and create chaos. How would the system handle that?
That's a critical point. Any system designed for ONOE would need to be incredibly robust and flexible to accommodate unforeseen circumstances. And even beyond logistics, there's the question of voter education. How do you ensure that voters, particularly in rural areas, fully understand the implications of voting for both their local representative and the national government on the same ballot?
That's crucial. You don't want voters feeling overwhelmed or making uninformed decisions just because the system is too complex. So we've laid out, the basic arguments for and against ONOE, but let's go a little deeper into the specific details of the potential advantages and disadvantages. What else did our research uncover?
This whole debate about the pros and cons of one nation, one election, it isn't unique to India. Lots of democracies around the world are wrestling with similar questions.
That's a good point. Didn't you mention that some countries are already doing this? I think it would be helpful to zoom out a bit and see what lessons we can draw from their experiences, both good and bad.
Absolutely. Let's start with a country that might surprise you. The United States.
Oh, interesting.
While they don't have a pure one nation, one election system, they do hold their federal elections every 2 years, and those always coincide with various state and local elections.
So Americans are already used to voting for multiple offices on the same ballot.
Right.
That sounds pretty similar to what India is proposing.
It is.
But has that system caused any problems in the U.S.?
It definitely has its critics.
Okay.
Some argue that it leads to voter fatigue,
Yeah.
especially in those off-year elections when the presidency isn't on the ballot. Others say it can overshadow local issues and give an advantage to the big national parties, which, as we discussed, is a concern in the Indian context as well.
That's interesting. So the U.S. model offers a kind of a cautionary tale, a reminder that even with simultaneous elections, you still need to make sure that those local voices are heard. But are there any countries that have fully embraced one nation, one election, and made it work well?
There are. South Africa is a good example. They hold national and provincial elections on the same day every 5 years. And it seems to be working fairly smoothly. They've managed to streamline their electoral process and reduce costs without any major hiccups.
Okay, so South Africa shows it can be done, but what about the flip side? Are there any countries that tried this and totally crashed and burned? Because those failures, they could be just as instructive as the successes.
You're right. It's important to learn from mistakes. And the Philippines offers a cautionary tale.
Okay.
They experimented with synchronized elections back in the 1990s, but ultimately abandoned the system.
Why didn't it work out in the Philippines? What went wrong?
Well, they ran into several major problems. One was the sheer complexity of coordinating elections across a vast archipelago.
Right.
Imagine trying to get ballots and election officials to hundreds of islands.
Yeah.
I mean, the logistics were a nightmare.
Oh, wow.
And they also faced issues with ensuring adequate security and preventing voter fraud, which are challenges India would need to address very carefully.
It sounds like the Philippines might be a more relevant example for India than the U.S.
All right.
Both countries are dealing with large, diverse populations spread across challenging geographies.
Right.
So what can India learn from their experience?
I think the key takeaway is that you can't just assume a system will work just because it looks good on paper or because it's working somewhere else.
Right.
The success of one nation, one election depends heavily on the specific context of each country.
So there's no magic formula. It's not as simple as saying South Africa did it, so India can too.
Exactly. You have to consider factors like the size and diversity of the electorate, the strength of democratic institutions,
Okay.
and even the level of public trust in the electoral process. All of those things come into play.
Okay. So we've looked at the U.S., South Africa, and the Philippines. Each offers a different perspective on the challenges and potential pitfalls of simultaneous elections.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, this is a decision that India has to make for itself. So where do we go from here?
Right.
What are the big questions that Indian policymakers should be asking as they weigh this decision?
Well, if I were advising them, I'd say the first step is to thoroughly study the experiences of those countries we just discussed and others that have experimented with similar systems. Look closely at what worked, what didn't work, and why.
Because blindly copying another country's model without understanding the nuances, it's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And beyond looking at other countries, I'd urge them to pay very close attention to the logistical aspects.
Yeah.
They need to develop a plan that's both robust and flexible, something that can handle the inevitable challenges that come with running a nationwide election in a country as complex as India.
Right. It's not just about getting the ballots printed and the polling booth set up.
Right.
It's about making sure those ballots reach remote villages, that the polling booths are accessible to everyone, and that there are systems in place to prevent fraud and ensure the integrity of the vote.
Absolutely. And they can't forget about the human element. You need to train millions of election officials, educate voters about the new system,
Right.
and build public confidence that this is a change that will benefit everyone.
It sounds like a massive undertaking. But even if they figure out all those logistical hurdles, there's still the political challenge of building consensus,
Yes.
which, as we've mentioned, is no small feat in India's diverse political landscape.
You're absolutely right. For one nation, one election to work, it can't be seen as a power grab by one party or a way to manipulate the system.
Right.
It needs to have genuine buy-in from across the political spectrum.
That's a crucial point, because if people see this as a partisan move, it will undermine public trust in the entire electoral process. So it sounds like a lot of stars would need to align for this to actually happen.
It does. And even if India decides to go for it, this isn't something you can rush. It would require careful planning, extensive consultations, and a phased implementation to iron out any wrinkles along the way.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground on this one nation, one election idea. We've explored the arguments for and against, looked at the historical context in India, and even zoomed out to consider what other countries can teach us.
But we're not done yet. In part 3, we'll step back and consider the bigger picture, what this debate means for India and for democracies around the world.
It's amazing, as we've been going through all this research on one nation, one election, it's become clear that this debate is about way more than just logistics or saving money.
Yeah, it really does touch on some fundamental questions, like about the nature of democracy itself. What are the trade-offs between efficiency and accountability? How do we ensure that all voices are heard, especially at the local level? These are questions that, like, every democracy grapples with.
And it makes you wonder, is one nation, one election ultimately about making the system, like, more efficient? Or is it about fundamentally shifting the balance of power in a democracy?
That is a really profound question, and it gets to the heart of the debate.
Yeah.
On one hand, proponents of ONOE argue that fewer elections would lead to greater stability and allow governments to focus on those long-term goals without the constant distraction of campaigning.
Right.
They point to the potential economic benefits, the reduced strain on resources, and even the idea that voters might be more engaged in a single high-stakes election.
Right. And those are compelling arguments, especially in a world facing complex challenges that require long-term solutions. But on the other hand, critics worry that holding simultaneous elections could undermine the very essence of democratic accountability.
Exactly. They argue that frequent elections, even if they're messy, even if they're expensive, that's the price we pay for keeping those in power in check. Regular elections force politicians to stay connected to their constituents and be responsive to their needs. They prevent power from becoming too concentrated and ensure that the government remains accountable to the people.
So it's a delicate balancing act. You have the potential for efficiency and stability on one side, and the need for accountability and responsiveness on the other. And there's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution.
You got it. The best approach for one country might be completely wrong for another. It all depends on the specific context. the political culture, the geographic challenges, the level of trust in institutions. And it's crucial to remember that any change to the electoral system is going to have both intended and unintended consequences.
Which brings us back to India. They're at a crossroads, trying to decide if this bold experiment is the right path forward. What advice would you give to Indian policymakers as they navigate this complex issue?
If I were advising them, I'd say the first step is to thoroughly study the experiences of those countries we just discussed. And others that have experimented with similar systems, look closely at what worked, what didn't work, and why.
Because blindly copying another country's model without understanding those nuances, it's just a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And beyond looking at other countries, I'd urge them to pay very, very close attention to the logistical aspects.
Yeah.
They need to develop a plan that's both robust and flexible, something that can handle the inevitable challenges that come with running a nationwide election in a country as complex as India.
Right. It's not just about getting the ballots printed and the polling booths set up.
Right.
It's about making sure those ballots actually reach remote villages, that the polling booths are accessible to everyone,
Yes,
and that there are systems in place to prevent fraud and ensure the integrity of the vote.
absolutely. And they can't forget about that human element.
Right.
You need to train millions of election officials, educate voters about the new system, and build public confidence that this is a change that will benefit everyone.
It sounds like a massive undertaking. But even if they figure out all those logistical hurdles, there's still the political challenge of building consensus, which, as we've mentioned, is no small feat in India's diverse political landscape.
You're absolutely right. For one nation, one election to work, it can't be seen as a power grab by one party or a way to manipulate the system. It needs to have genuine buy-in from across the political spectrum.
That's a crucial point, because if people see this as a partisan move, it'll undermine public trust in the entire electoral process.
For sure.
So it sounds like a lot of stars would need to align for this to actually happen.
It does. And even if India decides to go for it, this isn't something you can rush. It would require careful planning, extensive consultations, and a phased implementation to iron out any wrinkles along the way.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive into one nation, one election. We've explored the arguments for and against the proposal, looked at the historical context in India, and even zoomed out to consider what we can learn from other democracies around the world. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
And I hope we've given you, the listener, a better understanding of the complexities of this issue and the profound implications it holds for India and perhaps for other democracies watching this debate unfold.
This isn't just an academic exercise. These are real-world decisions with real-world consequences. And it's a debate that's only going to intensify in the years to come. So as you think about one nation, one election, consider this. Is it ultimately about streamlining the process? Or is it about fundamentally altering the relationship between citizens and their government? What are the trade-offs we're willing to make in the pursuit of efficiency? And how do we ensure that those trade-offs don't come at the expense of democratic values? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this complex and fascinating debate. What resonates most with you? Share your reactions, your follow-up questions, or even examples from other countries that could shed light on this issue. Remember, the deep dive is more than just information. It's a springboard for your own exploration.